Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Gabriela Andrade, or Gabi for short. I'm a researcher at CBA, and today I'm going to be talking about technology inspired by nature, biomimetics, materials, and artificial life. So these are some of the topics I'm going to cover today. Ecology, biology, and biological materials represent life as it is. Design and engineering and computer science that benefit from biomimetics, these are imitating life, and finally artificial life that represents life as it could be. When it comes to biomimetics, there are many sources of inspiration. You could get inspiration from an organism, a behavior, or the whole ecosystem. And when it comes to an organism, you can get inspiration from its shape, materials, the way it develops, processes, and its function. So here, as an example, I bring the case of this train developed in Japan. They had a huge problem with the noise it caused. And by mimicking nature, mimicking the kingfisher, they managed to develop a solution that stayed under 70 decibel. And it was also 10% faster and used 15% less electricity. Another example, now at the level of a material, we have a product called Never Wet. It covers surfaces using a solution very similar to that of the lotus leaves that possesses self-cleaning and hydrophobic properties. Here's a minimalist foraging algorithm that I developed during my PhD. It's inspired by the foraging behavior of C. elegans. It's a very simple organism, and this is also a minimalist algorithm that aims to be applied for robots. As you can see here, the more optimized generations at the right-hand side, they are learning to find the patches of food in the center and also avoiding the threats. There are the red spotlights surrounding the food. So broadly, we can think of biomimetics by having two different approaches. So the first one, top-down, usually starts from a problem or demand, an industrial demand usually, and then through research, you find a potential solution in nature. You can also approach these as a bottom-up process. So you start from a potential or a solution that you find in nature and find an industrial application for that. But still, when we consider the building blocks that are available for us in nature and as part of our engineering and design systems, they are completely different. So in nature, we have muscles, tissues, biological materials, they are very intricate. And whereas in engineering, we have wheels, engines, wires, they are completely different. So that's something to take into account when you're designing or creating a project, since you're going to have to deal with the transition of nature to the components that are available for us, the building blocks. This is something that has to be considered when you're using nature to inspire a project. You can see here on your left-hand side a cheetah, the animal in nature, and on the right side you can see the robot inspired by it, created by MIT. And despite the enormous capacity of MIT, you can tell that there are still some challenges when it comes to these building blocks. Another aspect to consider when you're taking inspiration from nature is scale and biomechanics. So here you can see how a scaled 1.8 ton gazelle would look like. Pretty scary. But it turns out that it's not feasible in nature because nature follows more the path of elastic similarity rather than geometric similarity. So this is another point that you should take into account when you're taking inspiration from nature. Still, when we're talking about biomechanics, it's important to notice that when you're migrating from air to water or the other way around. You should also consider viscosity of the media and many other aspects. The brochures you can see here are very well done by Festo, the company, and they take into account these aspects that I just mentioned. So is everything in nature worth copying? Well, if we consider that genus Homo, we've been here for quite a short time, but for millions of years, we have on Earth multicellular organisms, and if we consider the whole age of life that has billions of years, there's a lot of evolution, survival of the fittest, trial and error, and I should say error and trial. Another point to consider is what Gary Marcus describes as a biological kludge, which describes a clumsy or inelegant, yet surprisingly effective solution to a problem. In Portuguese, we would probably call it gambiarra, and that's a word used by engineers to describe solutions that are far from ideal, but still they get the job done. An example of that is the human spine. So anyone who ever had a back pain should agree with me that it's not the ideal solution. But in a context that was probably an African savanna or forest, standing up and seeing predators from a distance and having your hands free to use tools or to defend yourself was definitely better. In that sense, it came at the cost of your spine, our spine, and the females had a bit of a problem giving birth, but still it seemed to evolve as the best solution for that environment. Gary Marcus uses the metaphor of two or more hills to describe this concept, whereby as a species or a solution evolves, they ascend a peak, which brings them closer, yet further to the other peaks. Closer in terms of height, yet more distance in terms of space. And then we come to another concept, which I find particularly useful for biomimetics, which is the one of convergent evolution. So the way George McGee describes it, and I find it particularly useful, is through identifying species that had a different evolutionary path, yet they converged to very similar solutions. So here on top we have fish that evolved a similar shape, a fusiform shape, and on the bottom you can see reptiles that no longer exist, and also mammals, and these still exist. All of these evolved very similar shapes, but the evolutionary path that led to it was completely different. So fish started in water, and reptiles and mammals evolved from animals that were originally in the land. So they made their way back to the water, and still they found pretty similar solutions. Here, in a slightly different context, we have 4 species of mammals that found very similar solutions to glide. And as you can see in the map, the regions they appear are completely separate from each other, and yet they found very similar solutions. Similarly, we have reptiles that somehow evolved gliding structures, and the way that evolution and their genes found to do is through the flattening of their bodies, and yet they are able to glide. Amphibians managed to find these gliding solutions through membranes in their feet, and even fish managed to find a way to glide, as you can see here. And even ants, even these arthropods found their way to glide, or at least fall with style, by flattening their limbs. We also find many convergent traits and structures across many different species. So here bring the example of the gastropod abalone, studied by Professor Meyer's group. The gecko's foot structure surface, as you can see here, and many other examples studied by Professor Gorb. And here we find a very similar structure in the golden mussel. It has many ciliary prolongments in their surface to attach to places. This is part of a work in which we measure the whole surface. but are only the convergent traits worth copying? Of course not. There are many unique solutions in nature, and probably the reason they didn't appear elsewhere is because we didn't give it enough time, or maybe the other species didn't have the genetic background to evolve it. So, for instance, we have this species of invasive plant, Salvinia, and it has very peculiar structures, and the way it works has been characterized by one of my fellow researchers, Ernan. It has very interesting properties of being hydrophobic, but also having a hydrophilic tip that holds the water on it. So now that we've seen nature, what is beyond nature? That's another topic I want to cover today, which is artificial life. It came to my attention during my PhD, and it was first named by Christopher Langton in 1986. And the idea here is not only to model life as we know it, but also to go further and think of life as it might be. Here I'm going to show you one of the works in progress. So we've been using A-life models to try and understand the complexity of the biofilms, which is an emergent form of bacterial life. In the same biofilm, you have many different species that coexist and share that environment and also spread through the surfaces. Here you can see two of our simulations, and on the left-hand side, you can see a surface of temperature 20 degrees. On the right-hand side, it's 100 degrees. And you can see the colonization of this surface and the building up of the biofilm. And eventually it creates the right environment for different types of bacteria to join this biofilm. With this work, we also want to observe the emergent properties of this biofilm, which is not possible at the moment with the instruments we have. My colleagues and I are going to be submitting this paper very soon, so if you're interested, please look out for it. So one of the reasons to better understand biofilms is to try and find better ways to combat it, especially in the places where it's undesired, such as industrial plants, industrial pipes, with a particular attention to those that are difficult to reach. And here I'm presenting a project with a fellow designer and fellow researcher, Vinicius Abreu. And we've been thinking of robots that would perhaps become part of this ecosystem. And for that, we also took inspiration from nature, thinking of which kind of animals we could have that, which kind of robots could live there and eventually feed on this biofilm. Here's one of our ideas. We think that it could feed from the biofilm, perhaps using microbial fuel cells for it. And we could remotely control them, or they could have an embedded algorithm for that. Here's another example, one of our projects that's still ongoing. And that would be inspired by a squid. And we could also have some sort of tentacles brushing these pipes from the inside and living there, keeping it clean, etc. So, all things said, what happens if we can't copy nature? At least if we can't copy it now, at the moment. I've already talked about the building blocks that are available to us, at least at the moment. And sometimes we know that nature itself is still better than any sensor or anything that we could produce, or at least it's in a more affordable way. Using nature is still an option. So when we think about the golden mussel, that, by the way, has one of the highest filtration rates, and it's compatible and comparable to many other invasive species. They are very successful, and maybe that's the reason as well, or at least one of the reasons that contribute to it. So maybe what we have with us is a bunch of sensors that are able to sample a high volume of water. At the beginning of this year, it came to my attention this project, this case in Poland, where they have been using clams to monitor water quality, particularly for drinking water. And basically they have 8 clams. So if and when they detect some sort of disturbance in the water, they close their shells, and that triggers some sort of action at the level of the system that will perhaps interrupt the distribution of the water, at least temporarily, until this can be properly checked. And we have a similar opportunity with the golden mussel, however, only in the places that it became established. It's a way to make the best out of a bad situation. So with the help of some of my colleagues that work hard in the lab to keep the mussels alive, we've been observing its behavior and trying to see if that would be feasible. And here's a very simple and initial proof of concept in which I'm trying to test some sensors and check its sensitivity. And so far, so good. Of course, we need to improve it a little. There's still lots to do. So the way I like to think of it is that maybe in the near future, instead of being only a species we monitor, the golden mussel could be also a species that helps us monitor water quality. And who knows, maybe it could become one of our building blocks for precise, low cost, and very effective water quality monitoring systems. So that's it. Thank you very much. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please send me an email. I'm going to be in one of the panels here later. That's it. Thank you.